Jake had never considered himself a troublemaker. In fact, he was the kind of guy who just wanted to enjoy his home in peace. His house was his sanctuary, his driveway a simple convenience, until the day everything changed. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, stuffed inside his mailbox like an afterthought. It was an official notice from the HOA marked with the bold red stamp that made his stomach drop before he even opened it. HOA letters were never good news. They were either an announcement about some new, pointless rule or a fine for an imaginary infraction, but this time it was worse. Effective immediately, your driveway is in violation of HOA aesthetics guidelines. You have 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines and legal action. Jake read the words twice, then a third time. What kind of insanity was this? His driveway had been there for years, poured concrete, smooth, functional. Nothing fancy, but nothing offensive either. It wasn't cracked, wasn't overgrown, and sure as hell wasn't violating any kind of structural integrity. So why was it being banned now? Jake's fingers clenched the paper as he scanned the rest of the notice. No explanation, no warning, just a threat. His jaw tightened as he spotted the signature at the bottom, Ms. Kensington, HOA President. Of course it was her. Ms. Kensington was the kind of HOA leader people whispered about behind closed doors, a woman whose sole joy in life seemed to come from making everyone else miserable. She ran the HOA like a dictatorship, enforcing rules that made no sense, fining people for infractions that only she seemed to notice. Jake had dealt with her nonsense before. There was the time she fined his neighbor for having excessively tall sunflowers in their yard, or when she harassed the old couple down the street over the color of their garden gnome, but banning a driveway? Jake stormed inside, letter in hand, already dialing the HOA office. It rang 3 times before a robotic voice greeted him. "You have reached the Homeowners Association office. Our business hours are from—" He hung up. No way was he waiting around for some voicemail game. He needed answers, and he needed them now. So he did the one thing Ms. Kensington didn't expect. He went straight to her house. Jake had never been to Ms. Kensington's house before, but it wasn't hard to find. It was the biggest house on the block, the one with the perfectly manicured lawn, the symmetrical flower beds, the kind of property that screamed, "I'm in charge." When he knocked, he expected a polite but firm conversation. Maybe some ridiculous bureaucratic excuse about why his driveway had to go. What he didn't expect was the smirk waiting for him when the door opened. "Oh," Ms. Kensington said, feigning surprise. Jake, what a surprise. Her voice was dripping with condescension, and Jake's temper flared. "I got your letter," he said, holding up the paper. "Care to explain what kind of nonsense this is?" She gave a slow, deliberate smile. "Your driveway doesn't meet the newly updated HOA standards." "What standards?" "It's been fine for years." Ms. Kensington folded her arms. "We've updated the guidelines to ensure the community maintains a unified, aesthetically pleasing look. Your driveway is an eyesore." Jake narrowed his eyes. "It's concrete, like half the other houses here." She shrugged. "That's not my problem. The board has already voted. You have 30 days to remove it." Jake almost laughed in disbelief, the sheer arrogance of it. "Oh, and Jake," she added, tilting her head, "if you don't comply, we'll start issuing fines, and after that we'll escalate to legal action." Her smirk told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't about rules, it was about power. Jake wasn't just getting a violation, he was being targeted. After storming away from Ms. Kensington's house, Jake decided to see if he was the only victim. He spent the next 2 hours knocking on doors, talking to neighbors, and what he uncovered made his blood boil. One neighbor, an older man named Tom, had been fined for having a front door that was too dark. Another, a single mom named Rachel, was forced to replace her mailbox because it wasn't in line with some mystery regulation that didn't exist last year. And the worst? A family down the block was in the middle of a lawsuit because the HOA demanded they tear down their custom-built patio after the HOA had originally approved it. Jake's anger turned to resolve. This wasn't just about his driveway. This was a war. And if Miss Kensington thought he was going to roll over, she had another thing coming. The next day, Jake walked into the HOA meeting ready for a fight. The room was packed, filled with concerned homeowners, all whispering about the recent wave of absurd enforcement. Ms. Kensington sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal board members, each one looking as smug as ever. Jake wasted no time. He stepped forward and held up the letter. "This," he said, voice firm, "is absolute garbage." A murmur spread through the room. People nodded, whispered, a few even clapped. Ms. Kensington sighed theatrically. "Jake, this isn't up for debate." "Oh, I think it is," he shot back, "because I've spoken to half the people in this room, and I think they're tired of your made-up rules." A wave of agreement rippled through the crowd. For a moment, it looked like momentum was on Jake's side. Then Ms. Kensington played her trump card. She pulled out a new document and slid it across the table. Jake picked it up, heart pounding. It was a copy of the HOA's updated bylaws, and there, buried in the fine print, was the clause, "Any non-standard driveways must be removed upon request of the HOA board to ensure uniformity in the neighborhood." The ink was fresh. They had changed the rules after sending the violation. The rage that surged through Jake was unlike anything he'd ever felt. This wasn't just an injustice. This was a declaration of war. Jake left that meeting with one goal. If they were going to take away his driveway, he was going to make sure they regretted it. He went home, pulled up his laptop, and started researching HOA loopholes, city regulations, and construction laws. And that's when he found it. A loophole so perfect, so irrefutable, that he almost laughed out loud. If they didn't want him to have a driveway, then fine. He wouldn't have one. He'd have something better. A moat. Jake sat in front of his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off his narrowed eyes. His mind was racing. The HOA thought they had won. They thought they could rewrite the rules and bulldoze his rights without consequence. They thought he would roll over and comply like a good little homeowner. They were wrong. If they wanted to play dirty, he'd play dirtier. The moment he stumbled across the loophole buried deep within the city's zoning laws, his lips curled into a grin so wide it almost hurt. Water features. According to the regulations, while the HOA had authority over driveways and non-standard ground structures, they had no jurisdiction over decorative water features, and nothing in their newly amended bylaws said a word about them either, which meant, if his driveway wasn't a driveway anymore, if it was, say, a decorative water feature, they couldn't do a damn thing about it. The very next day, Jake put in a call to a construction company. Not just any company, one that specialized in ponds, fountains, and high-end landscaping projects. When the team arrived, they took one look at the job and blinked in disbelief. "You want us to dig a trench where your driveway used to be?" the foreman asked, scratching his head. Jake grinned. "Not just a trench, a moat." The workers exchanged uncertain glances. "I've got all the legal paperwork," Jake added, holding up his approved city permits. "This is fully compliant with zoning laws, and I'm paying in full, up front." At the mention of payment in full, the foreman's doubts evaporated. By the following morning, the digging started, and that's when the chaos erupted. Jake had been expecting her. In fact, he was surprised it took 4 whole hours before he saw her furious silhouette storming across his lawn. Miss Kensington's face was a twisted mask of outrage as she marched straight up to him, red-faced and trembling. "What the hell is this?" she shrieked, gesturing wildly at the massive trench that was already stretching across his property. Jake leaned against his porch railing, arms crossed, watching her meltdown with pure satisfaction. "It's a decorative water feature," he said, voice smooth as silk. "This is not a water feature," she spat. This is a legally approved HOA-compliant landscaping project." Ms. Kensington looked like she was about to explode. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the official city permit, waving it in front of her face. "I made sure to check with the city before starting construction," he said, his tone light but laced with unmistakable triumph. Turns out the HOA has no authority over water features. Her nostrils flared. You can't just, oh, I can. He smirked. And I did. Behind them, the sound of digging intensified as the construction crew worked tirelessly, their shovels and machinery kicking up clouds of dust and dirt. Ms. Kensington was losing control, and she knew it. But Jake wasn't done yet, not even close. By the next morning, his moat was half finished. Jake had already planned the next phase. He'd be lining the trench with stone, adding a recirculating filtration system, even installing underwater lights. It was going to be beautiful, it was going to be unstoppable, and it was going to drive the HOA insane. Sure enough, as he sipped his morning coffee, he saw Ms. Kensington and two other HOA board members marching down the sidewalk, clipboards in hand. Jake stepped outside just as they arrived. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" he said, taking a deliberate sip. Ms. Kensington's eyes were practically twitching. "This is a safety hazard," she snapped, pointing to the moat. Jake arched a brow. "It's on my private property, and according to city regulations, it's compliant. Would you like to read the permit again?" One of the board members cleared his throat. "We've had complaints," he said stiffly. Jake grinned. "From who?" A pause. Ms. Kensington gritted her teeth. "We're issuing you a cease and desist order," she declared, yanking a document from her clipboard and shoving it at him. Jake took it, glanced over it, and then laughed. "This isn't even real," he said, shaking his head. "It's just an official-looking piece of paper with zero legal standing." He looked up at her, eyes glinting with victory. "You can't stop me." Miss Kensington looked like she wanted to scream, but she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed away. Jake watched her retreating figure with a satisfied smirk. He had won round one. By the end of the week, the moat was fully functional. The water flowed perfectly, the filtration system hummed quietly, and at night, the underwater lights made it look like something straight out of a fantasy castle. And the best part? Jake had installed a retractable wooden drawbridge. Whenever someone wanted to cross onto his property, they had to wait for him to lower it. The neighborhood loved it. Kids were fascinated, asking their parents if they could build moats too. Neighbors whispered and giggled behind Ms. Kensington's back. Jake had turned her power move into a complete joke. Ms. Kensington wasn't done. The following morning, Jake woke up to find a city inspector on his doorstep. Ms. Kensington, standing behind him, smiled triumphantly. Jake's stomach clenched. Had she actually found a way to shut this down? The inspector cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report that your property is in violation of local safety codes." Jake blinked. "Safety codes?" Ms. Kensington beamed. "That's right. Your moat poses a drowning risk. It's a hazard." Jake stared at her, then at the inspector, and then he smiled. "Ah," he said slowly. "So I assume you're also here to inspect the HOA's ornamental pond at the entrance of the neighborhood." The inspector frowned. "What?" Jake pulled out printed photos of the HOA's own unfenced, unprotected deep water feature. "It's twice as deep as my moat," he said, voice dripping with satisfaction. "And since it's owned by the HOA, they're liable." The inspector looked at Miss Kensington. Her face went bone white. You can't." "Oh, I can." The inspector sighed. "I'll have to report this back to the city. If your water feature is unsafe, so is theirs." Jake watched with pure amusement as Miss Kensington spiraled into a panicked frenzy. She had tried to destroy him, and instead she had signed her own death warrant. That evening, Jake stood on his porch, watching Miss Kensington frantically making phone calls, her empire crumbling around her. His moat wasn't just a victory, it was the first crack in the foundation of the HOA itself. And Jake, he was just getting started. Miss Kensington wasn't just furious, she was unraveling. The moment Jake exposed the HOA's ornamental pond as an equal, if not greater, safety hazard than his moat, panic set in. Overnight, the HOA's perfect grip on the neighborhood began to crack. Whispers turned into full-blown outrage as neighbors realized what was happening. If the HOA forced Jake to remove his moat, they'd have to remove their own pond, too. And if that pond went, so did the fancy entrance sign, the decorative stonework, and a chunk of the HOA's beautification budget. Jake had backed them into a corner, and everyone knew it. But instead of admitting defeat, Ms. Kensington doubled down. The next morning, a fresh violation notice appeared on Jake's door. Unlike the last one, this wasn't about his driveway or even his moat. It was about his unauthorized bridge. The letter read, "Due to a recent amendment in the HOA bylaws, all overhead or retractable bridge structures must be formally approved by the board. Your current structure is non-compliant and must be removed within 14 days." Jake laughed out loud. She was scrambling, desperate to claw back power in the pettiest way possible. It was almost pathetic. Almost. Jake crumpled the letter and tossed it over his shoulder. Time to hit back. Jake knew that fighting Ms. Kensington in closed meetings was useless. She controlled the board. But what she didn't control? The entire town. So Jake did the one thing that no one had dared to do before. He scheduled an open meeting with the city council. Not just about his moat, about the HOA itself. The night of the meeting, the room was packed. Neighbors, homeowners, even some people from nearby communities who had heard about the HOA's corruption. Ms. Kensington sat near the front, her expression carved from stone. Jake took the microphone and laid it all out. The HOA's history of selective enforcement, the fabricated rules, the intimidation tactics, and most importantly, the embezzlement scandal that no one was talking about yet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jake had done his research. He had dug through public financial records and found discrepancies in the HOA's expenses. Tens of thousands of dollars labeled as maintenance that had no paper trail. Ms. Kensington's face drained of color. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jake leaned into the mic, voice calm. "If the HOA is truly looking out for the community, then why are thousands of our dollars missing?" The crowd exploded. Ms. Kensington stormed out. Jake just watched her go, knowing he had finally done it. The tide was turning. Jake should have expected retaliation, but even he was surprised by how low they stooped. It happened at 2:37 a.m. A sound, faint but distinct, a sloshing noise. Jake sat up in bed, ears straining. He slipped out from under the covers, grabbed his phone, and checked the security cameras. And there in the grainy night vision feed, he saw them. Two men in dark clothing, standing at the edge of his moat, holding hoses. They were trying to drain it. Jake's blood turned to ice, but instead of panicking, he smiled. Because what the HOA didn't know was that he had upgraded his security system 2 days ago. The cameras weren't just recording, they were live streaming to the entire neighborhood. Jake didn't confront them, didn't rush outside like they probably expected. Instead, he let them finish. Let them think they had won. And then, at exactly 7 a.m., he uploaded the footage. By 8 a.m., it had spread like wildfire. By 9 a.m., people were demanding answers. By noon, the HOA's legal team was scrambling. And by that evening, Ms. Kensington was on the local news, forced to give a statement. She tried to play it off as a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. Her authority was in tatters. The HOA had become a laughingstock. And Jake? He was about to finish the job. With the footage everywhere, the HOA board fractured. Some members tried to distance themselves from Ms. Kensington. Others resigned outright. Jake wasn't satisfied. He started a petition to formally recall the entire HOA leadership, and the signatures poured in. Within 2 weeks, Ms. Kensington's worst nightmare became reality. A town hall was scheduled, and this time it wasn't just about Jake's moat. It was about removing her. The night of the vote, the atmosphere was electric. Jake sat near the front, arms crossed. Ms. Kensington stood at the podium, eyes scanning the crowd. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the confidence. She knew she had already lost. One by one, neighbors took the mic. airing years of grievances, telling stories of harassment, fines, and abuse of power. Jake didn't even need to say anything. By the time the votes were counted, it was over. Ms. Kensington was out, the HOA board was dismantled, and in its place, a new leadership team, one that actually listened to the homeowners. Jake's moat was officially recognized as a landmark of victory, and Ms. Kensington, she packed up and moved out within the month. Jake didn't just win, he changed everything. With the HOA dissolved, homeowners finally had freedom. Driveways were rebuilt, gardens were restored. The neighborhood became a community again. And Jake? He expanded his moat. Because, as it turned out, the new neighborhood leadership thought it was the best thing to ever happen to the area. They even started discussing plans for a second one. Jake sat on his porch, looking at his victory. His home was finally his again. And the HOA? They would never rise again. The remaining members resigned, one after another, until nothing was left. The HOA itself, once an unmovable force of power, disintegrated overnight. No more fines, no more absurd rules, no more Kensington. Jake stood in his yard looking over the ruins of his moat, knowing he had won, but his work wasn't done yet. Because now it was time for his final, ultimate move, something that would make sure no HOA ever tried to rise again. The real revenge was just beginning. Ms. Kensington was gone, her reign of terror over. The HOA was in shambles, its board members abandoning ship like rats from a sinking vessel. But Jake wasn't done, not yet. Winning the battle wasn't enough. He wanted to make sure no HOA ever rose from the ashes again. He wanted to erase every trace of their existence, ensuring that no future group of power-hungry bureaucrats could ever crawl out of the wreckage and start the cycle anew. The first step was securing a permanent end to the HOA itself. It wasn't enough that Ms. Kensington was arrested. The bylaws, the contracts, the very structure of the association, it all had to be dismantled legally. That meant rallying the entire neighborhood one final time. Most people thought that with the HOA board gone, the organization would simply dissolve on its own. Wrong. The HOA still legally existed as a corporate entity, and until it was voted out in an official community-wide referendum, the risk remained that someone, someday, might try to revive it. That wasn't going to happen. So, Jake made his final move, the vote to end it all. He organized a massive neighborhood meeting, bigger than any the HOA had ever held. Flyers were posted, emails were sent. Word spread like wildfire. By the time the night arrived, nearly every homeowner in the community was crammed into the town hall. Jake took the stage, standing beneath the bright fluorescent lights, looking over the sea of faces that had once been cowed into silence by HOA threats, but not anymore. He held up a document, the official HOA dissolution agreement. All it needed was a 67% vote from the homeowners. Once that threshold was met, the HOA would be legally erased. No more fines, no more pointless restrictions, no more arbitrary rules. He didn't make a long speech. He didn't need to. "I think we all know why we're here," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "You've all lived under their rule. You've all seen what they did. And now it's time to decide if we ever want to give them the chance to do it again." He laid the document on a table in the center of the room. One by one, people approached, and they signed. Names filled the pages rapidly, pens scratching against paper, one signature after another, a collective act of defiance against the tyranny they had all endured. The final count? 92% voted to dissolve the HOA. It wasn't just a win, it was a landslide. The moment the final signature was added, Jake took a breath. It was over. The paperwork was submitted the very next morning, and within weeks the legal dissolution was finalized. The HOA ceased to exist. The community, now free from its iron grip, took on a new identity, one of independence, where homeowners actually had a say in their own properties. But Jake wasn't done yet, because while the HOA was dead, his moat still needed to be rebuilt. With no HOA in the way, Jake had complete creative freedom. And he wasn't about to just rebuild his moat, he was going to make it a legend. He brought in a professional landscape designer, an architect, and a full construction crew. If people thought the first moat was impressive, they had no idea what was coming next. This time it wasn't just a trench with water, it was a full medieval-inspired masterpiece. Stone walls lined the edges, giving it the look of an ancient fortress. The bridge was rebuilt, not just as a retractable walkway, but a motorized drawbridge controlled by remote. Underwater lighting transformed the water at night, glowing with an ethereal blue, making it look almost magical. A filtration system kept it crystal clear, with koi fish introduced to add a touch of elegance. Custom landscaping was added around it, turning his yard into something straight out of a fantasy novel. When the project was finally completed, it wasn't just a moat, it was an attraction. People from other neighborhoods drove by just to see it. Local papers ran stories about the man who built a moat to defeat the HOA. The community, now free of its former chains, embraced it completely. Some even joked about adding moats of their own. Jake stood on his porch, watching the shimmering water beneath his bridge, and he smiled. This was his final victory. Ms. Kensington had tried to erase his driveway. Now his property was a landmark. Jake hadn't thought much about what happened to Ms. Kensington after her arrest until he got a call from one of his neighbors. Apparently, after she was charged with trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property, she had taken a plea deal to avoid jail time. She paid fines, was forced to do community service, and worst of all, she lost her home. Her house, once the grandest in the neighborhood, was sold off to cover legal expenses. The irony? The new owners, a young couple who openly despised HOAs. They painted the house in bright colors, put up a lawn display that Kensington would have called tacky, and even installed a decorative flamingo garden in her former yard. Jake didn't even have to lift a finger. Karma had done all the work for him. And as for the HOA itself, the entity that had once ruled with an iron fist, it was nothing but a cautionary tale, a ghost of what once was. And Jake's moat stood as a permanent reminder of the day that tyranny fell. Jake never set out to be a hero. He never planned on starting a revolution. But when the HOA pushed him, he pushed back harder. His story spread online, reaching thousands, then millions, inspiring people across the country to stand up against their own overreaching HOAs. He received emails, messages, even letters from strangers, thanking him for proving that homeowners weren't powerless. Some even sent pictures of their own revenge projects. Someone built a 12-foot-tall inflatable dragon in their front yard after their HOA banned lawn ornaments. Another installed solar panels shaped like middle fingers after an HOA tried to fine them for unsightly modifications. The war against HOA tyranny had ignited a movement. And Jake? He just sat back on his porch, enjoying the sight of his perfect, untouchable moat. A glass of whiskey in hand, he took a slow sip, watching the sunset reflect off the water. No fines, no letters, no HOA goons knocking on his door. Just peace. He exhaled, content. They had tried to take away his driveway. Instead, he had changed the neighborhood forever. And as he pressed the remote, raising his drawbridge one last time, he couldn't help but grin. Some battles are worth fighting, some victories last forever, and some revenge is absolutely legendary.